She walked into his building soaking wet with his son's betrayal still fresh on her skin, and the most feared man in Seoul looked up from his desk and made the mistake that 30 years of ruthless empire building had never once prepared him for. He let her sit. The rain came down on Seoul like a punishment, and Zara walked through it without caring. She was 21 years old, Ghanaian Korean, raised between the heat of Kumasi and the gray winters of Mapogu. And she had a face that people remembered and a mind that people underestimated, and for most of her life those two things together had been enough to navigate whatever room she was in. She had navigated university in a city that was not entirely hers. She had navigated a relationship with a boy who turned out to be something she did not have a clean word for. She had navigated 3 days in a hostel room with thin walls and a phone she kept turning face down because the notification sound had become physically painful. She was done navigating. She had an address, and she had 4 days of compressed rage, and she had nothing left to protect, which meant she had nothing left to lose, which meant she was, in a specific and clarifying way, the most dangerous version of herself she had ever been. The building was in Gangnam. Black glass and steel, 40 floors, the kind of lobby that cost money just to stand in. She pushed through the revolving door and a security guard looked up and did the calculation that guards in buildings like this always did, which was whether she belonged or whether she needed to be managed toward an exit. She crossed to the desk before he finished calculating. Kong Daewon, she said. In Korean. Fluent and flat. The guard blinked. Do you have an appointment? Tell him Zara is here. A phone call. A pause. The guard's expression shifted. Mr. Kong Daewon is not available today. She stood there in her wet clothes and she thought about the group chat. 340 people. The laughing emoji he sent when she called him. The 40,000 one she later found out he'd been paid, which was approximately what she spent on groceries in a week, which was what her body and her trust and 8 months of herself had been worth to him on whatever platform he'd used to sell them. His father, she said. Kong Sung-hyun. Tell him a girl named Zara is here about his son. The guard stared at her. He made a second call, shorter than the first, and his posture changed when the response came back the way posture always changes when the person on the other end of the line is someone whose instructions rearrange the air. 38th floor, the guard said quietly. Someone will meet you. She had not planned this. She had planned for day one. She had a specific architecture of confrontation prepared for day one, evidence organized on her phone, things she intended to say, and in what order. She had not planned for the father. She had not planned for any of the last 4 days. Planning had stopped being relevant the moment the notification appeared. She got in the elevator and watched the numbers rise. If you know that feeling, when the plan falls apart and something scarier and realer takes its place, you are exactly who this story was made for, and you need to subscribe right now because this elevator is about to open on something nobody planned for. The 38th floor was different from the lobby. Quieter. Dark wood paneling, real artwork on the walls, the specific hush of a place where decisions with consequences were made daily. A woman in a gray suit met her at the elevator and walked her down a corridor and opened a door and stepped aside without a word. Zara walked in. The office was large and serious, facing the city through floor-to-ceiling glass, soles spreading gray and enormous and rain-soaked in every direction below. There was a wide dark desk and behind it a man who looked up when she entered and did not look away. Kong Sung-hyun was 45 years old, and he was nothing like what she had prepared herself for on the elevator ride up. She had prepared herself for a version of day one, older and more polished, the same entitlement in a more expensive suit. What she found was different. He was lean and broad-shouldered with dark hair silvering at the temples and forearms covered in ink where his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, traditional Korean patterns disappearing under the fabric. His face was the kind of face that had been striking for so long it had moved past striking into something more permanent, something structural. And his eyes were dark and completely still, and they were looking at her with an attention that had nothing performative in it. He looked at her the way you look at something that has appeared where it doesn't belong and you are deciding what it means before you respond to it. You asked for my son, he said. Low voice. Even. He wasn't available, she said. So I asked for you. Why? She was still wet. Rain was still running from her hair. She was standing in one of the most powerful offices in Gangnam in clothes that had been rained on for 40 minutes, and she held his gaze and did not perform anything and said, "Because I came here for a reason, and I'm not leaving without doing something with it." He looked at her for a moment. "Sit down." "I'm wet." "I'll ruin your chair." "Sit down." She sat. He stood and walked to a cabinet on the side wall, opened it, removed a folded dark zip-up and crossed the office and held it out. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took it and pulled it on over her wet clothes and said nothing. He went back to his desk. He remained standing behind it, both hands flat on the surface. "Tell me why you're here," he said. So she told him. She told him about day one and the 8 months and the photographs she had sent in the specific privacy of a relationship she had believed was safe. She told him about the group chat notification at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. She told him about 340 people and 14 reshares before the post came down. She told him about the professors and the dormitory and the hostel room and the 4 days. She told him about standing on Tehran RO in the rain the night before and not moving when the headlights came. She told him about the man who stepped out of the car and asked if she was all right and gave her this address when she told him everything, a man who had apparently known Sung-hyun long enough to understand that this particular problem belonged at this particular door. She told him all of it without stopping and without softening any of it and without crying, which cost her something she didn't show. When she finished, the office was silent. Sung-hyun had not moved during any of it. He had watched her the entire time with that same focused stillness, and now he was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "My son did this," he said. "Yes. You have evidence." Screenshots. The original post timestamp. 37 minutes of activity before the report took it down. The payment record I found on his phone 3 days before when I borrowed it to call my mother because mine was dead. I didn't understand what I was looking at then. I understood 3 days later. Something moved through his expression. Fast and then gone, controlled the way everything about him was controlled, but she caught it. She was good at catching the things people moved through quickly because they didn't want them seen. He picked up his phone. He made a call, and when it connected he spoke in a register she hadn't heard from him yet. 3 sentences, quiet and absolutely final, the specific cadence of a man issuing an instruction that existed outside the category of discussion. He ended the call and put the phone down. "What did you just do?" she said. "Addressed part of the problem." "Which part?" "The person day one sold the photographs to will not be a problem after today. The payment record you found will be matched by additional records my people will locate. The group chat administrator will be contacted by someone whose contact they will take seriously." She stared at him. "You just did that. In 30 seconds. In one phone call," he said. "Yes. You don't know me." "No. So why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because my son did something that carries my name whether he remembered that or not. And because you are sitting in my office in wet clothes, because you had nowhere else to take this, and that is a situation I can do something about." He paused. "And because day one mentioned you. Once." He said he was seeing someone who made him feel like he was always one sentence behind her. The room held that. "He said it like a complaint," Sung-hyun said. "It was a complaint," she said. "He said it to me too. About 6 weeks before everything. 6 weeks before the photographs." "Yes." He nodded once. The calculation behind his eyes was visible and thorough, and she let it run without interrupting it. "Where are you staying?" he said. "The hostel. Mapogu. You can't return to the dormitory." "Not immediately. Maybe not at all this semester." "I haven't decided." "Is there family here?" "No. My mother is in Kumasi." She said it flatly, the flatness being the only structural support holding that particular sentence together. "I haven't told her." He looked at her for a moment. "I have a property in Itaewon. A studio on the 4th floor of a secured building. It's been empty for 3 months. The building manager lives on site." He said it in the tone of someone solving a logistical equation. No theater of generosity, just the clean identification of a solution. "You can stay there while you handle the university situation." She looked at him. "You're offering me somewhere to live." "I'm identifying an empty property." "That is the same thing." Is it something you need or not? She studied him across the desk. She thought about the hostel room and the thin walls, and the way she had been sitting on the edge of the bed for 4 days with the phone face down, getting up only to use the bathroom and occasionally to stand at the window and look at the street below with thoughts she was not proud of. Why are you doing this? She said. Not the logistical question. The real one. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, because you came in here and told me the truth without packaging it. No performance. No calculation about what I wanted to hear. You told me what happened the way it happened, and you sat in that chair in wet clothes, and you didn't ask me for anything, you just told me the truth. He looked at his desk surface. That is rarer in this office than you would think. She looked at him. She thought about what she had come here with. The plan. Day 1. The specific revenge she had been constructing for 4 days in that hostel room. Not just confrontation, but something more strategic, something that would take back the power in a permanent way. The plan had been about Day 1. But Day 1 wasn't here. And his father was. And his father had made one phone call and moved the earth under someone's feet like adjusting furniture, and was now looking at her across a wide dark desk with an expression that was more honest than anything his son had ever pointed in her direction. She was 21 years old, and she was not naive, and she understood the difference between a man doing something because it cost him nothing and a man doing something because it meant something. She was looking at the second kind, and she did not entirely know what to do with that. I'm not a charity case, she said. I'm not running a charity. If I take the studio, it's 2 weeks. Maximum. While I sort out the housing situation through the university. Fine. I'm not grateful in a way that creates any kind of obligation. The not-quite smile happened again at the corner of his mouth. Brief and structural and entirely unplanned. She could tell it was unplanned by the way he didn't use it. Understood. And I still intend to deal with Day 1 directly. The not-quite smile disappeared. So do I, he said. Separately. And more completely than you're in a position to. She stood. She was still wearing his zip-up. She looked down at it and reached for the zipper. Keep it, he said. You're still wet. She left it on. She looked at him standing behind his desk, and she thought about a version of this moment where she said thank you and took the address and left and went to the studio in Itaewon and sorted out the university situation and never came back to this floor. A clean exit. Sensible. Safe. You said Day 1 mentioned me, she said. Once. Yes. And you remembered. He held her gaze. Yes. She thought about what that meant and decided not to think about what that meant right now in this room while she was still wet and still raw and still holding herself together with the specific tension of someone who has been holding themselves together for 4 consecutive days. The address, she said. He wrote it on a card and slid it across the desk. She picked it up. She looked at it. She looked at him. I know who you are, she said. I know what your organization does and what it's built on and the kinds of things that don't get discussed. I looked you up 2 days ago when I found out Day 1 was your son. He said nothing. I'm not afraid of you, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. And the way he said it, quiet and direct and without any performance of being flattered by it, told her that this specific fact, her not being afraid, was the most unusual thing that had happened in this office in longer than he was going to say out loud. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. The man who stopped his car last night, she said. On Teherandro. Did he call you before I arrived? A pause. Yes. What did he tell you? That a young woman had been standing in the road. That she hadn't moved. That he had spoken to her for 20 minutes, and he was concerned, and he thought I should know she was coming. She absorbed that. So you already knew. Some of it. And you still let me tell you the whole thing myself. You needed to tell it yourself, he said simply. That's different from me already knowing it. She stood in the doorway for a moment. The gray-suited woman had reappeared silently in the corridor behind her, ready to walk her back to the elevator. The corridor was quiet and the city was gray through the window at the far end, and Seoul was doing what Seoul always did, which was continuing at full volume regardless of what any individual inside it was going through. Thank you, she said. Not performing gratitude. Just placing it accurately where it belonged. He nodded once. She walked out. The elevator descended. She watched her reflection in the mirrored doors, a girl in a stranger's zip-up holding a card with an address, her plan rearranged into something she didn't have a shape for yet. 38 floors. The lobby. The revolving door. The rain. She stood on the Gangnam pavement and she breathed. She thought about the plan. It had been about day one. It had always been about day one, about finding the lever that would give her back what he had taken. Not the photographs specifically, but the power, the sense of being a person who existed on her own terms and not as content someone else could package and sell. She thought about Sung-hyun behind his desk, making one phone call and shifting the ground. She thought about him saying you needed to tell it yourself. She thought about the not-quite smile, and the way he had looked at her when she said she wasn't afraid of him, like he was recalibrating something he had long stopped expecting to need to recalibrate. She was not going to pretend she didn't know what she was thinking. She was 21, and she had been betrayed and humiliated, and she had walked into traffic, and she had survived it, and she was standing on a pavement in Gangnam holding a card with an address on it, and she was thinking about a 45-year-old man with ink on his forearms who had looked at her like she was something that required his complete attention. She knew what the responsible version of herself would do with that thought, which was put it in a box and close the box and focus on rebuilding the practical structure of her life. She also knew that the responsible version of herself had been sitting in a hostel room for 4 days, turning her phone face down, and that had not been working. She put the card in her pocket. She started walking toward the subway. The city moved around her, enormous and indifferent, and she walked through it in his zip-up, and she let herself think the thought completely for exactly the length of one city block. Then she put it away and walked the rest of the way to the station thinking about practical things, about the studio and the university housing office and calling her mother, and what she was going to say, and in what order. But the thought had existed. Completely. For one full block in the rain. And that, she understood without wanting to, was how it started. Behind her, 38 floors above the street, Kang Sung-hyun stood at the window that faced the city and did not look at the street below, specifically chose not to look at the street below, and made 2 more calls that would systematically dismantle several things his son had quietly constructed for himself over the past 2 years. He was thorough and he was efficient, and he did not hesitate once during either call because hesitation was not something he had carried since he was 19 years old. When the calls were done, he stood in the silence of his office. He looked at the chair she had sat in, still slightly damp. He looked at the space on his desk where the address card had been. He looked at his own hands on the desk surface, the ink on his forearms, the hands of a man who had built something enormous over 30 years by being the person in the room who never flinched, never second-guessed, never felt anything that slowed the decision. He thought about a girl who had told him the truth without packaging it. He thought about "I'm not afraid of you" and the way she had meant it. He thought about "you needed to tell it yourself" and the fact that he had said that out loud to another person, which was not something he did, which was not a category of sentence he typically produced in this office, or any room. He was 45 years old, and he had been in rooms with presidents and criminals and people who were both, and he had not been nervous in any of them since the year he turned 19 and decided that nervous was a condition he could not afford and had subsequently removed it from his available responses. He was standing in his own office at 3:17 in the afternoon and his hands were not entirely still against the desk surface, and that had not happened in 26 years, and he was not going to pretend he didn't know what it was. He straightened up. He rolled his sleeves back down. He buttoned the cuffs. He sat back down at his desk, and he opened the file he had been working on before she arrived, and he read the first paragraph 4 times without retaining a word of it. He closed the file. He looked at the rain on the glass. He thought about a girl in his zip-up walking out of his building into the Seoul afternoon and the specific and inconvenient truth that he was going to want to know how she was tomorrow and the day after, and that this wanting was not going anywhere by itself and was not the kind of thing that responded to being told to stop. 30 years. Not once. He picked up his phone. He put it down. He was the most feared man in the city, and she had sat in his chair and made him nervous, and he hated her for it the same way you hate the rain when you've forgotten your umbrella, which is to say not really. Which is to say the hatred is mostly aimed at yourself for being caught without cover, for being the kind of person who can still be caught without cover after all this time. He looked at the rain. Outside, Seoul kept moving. Loud and lit, and completely without mercy, the way it always was, the way it had been on every significant day of his life, indifferent and alive and holding every story inside its noise without comment or judgment. Somewhere in it a girl was on a subway with his address in her pocket and his zip-up on her back and a plan she had arrived with that had been rearranged into something neither of them could name yet. He had told himself it was logistics. He was a man who had survived 30 years by never lying to himself, and the 31st year was apparently not going to be different. It was not logistics. It was the beginning of something he had no system for and no protocol for and no prior experience with, and it was going to be. He understood with the same clarity he brought to every assessment he had ever made in this office. The most complicated thing he had ever let into his life. He straightened the file on his desk. He breathed. Outside the window, Seoul blazed and roared and carried everyone inside it forward without asking whether they were ready. The same as it always had, the same as it always would. And in the morning there would be decisions to make and consequences to manage and an empire that did not run itself and a son who had a reckoning coming, and all of that was real and all of that required him. But right now, in this office, in the rain, for the length of one honest, unmanaged moment, Kang Sung-hyun allowed himself to feel the thing he felt. Then he picked up the file and went back to work. And if you stayed until the very last line of this story, you already know what kind of viewer you are, the kind who needs to know what happens next, the kind who felt every single thing in that last scene and is already choosing sides. Drop a comment right now telling us Team Zara or Team Sung-hyun. Like this video so it reaches the people who need a story this real. And subscribe because this is only the beginning, and what comes next between these two is going to be the most complicated and electric thing we have ever put on this channel. We will see you in the next one.